Hello, my name is Gabriel Fairman, and I'm going to talk to you today about how translators can become even more relevant in a post-Gen AI society. And before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about me. I'm the founder and CEO of BureauWorks. We're a cutting-edge translation management system. I'm headquartered out of Lafayette, California, just outside the Silicon Valley. Our platform is used by large global companies like Uber, Harley-Davidson, Zendesk, Scaled Agile, Automation Anywhere, and over 100 others. Thousands of freelancers around the globe, translation agencies alike. We cater to everybody, and we're very much focused on the future and what we can do with this technology to actually keep humans in the center of it all. And let's just talk really briefly about what's going on and where we are as far as our AI journey. We're just getting started. And I think this is important for us to remember because sometimes sometimes we have the misperception that we are already much further along a certain timeline than we are. We're just getting started. These are just the very first beginning baby steps of a vector that's going to go very deeply into the future. So this study here, for instance, this is from McKinsey and it's projecting all the way to 2070. I have no idea what's going to go on even next month. I don't by any means try to present myself as a visionary. I do have a very clear idea of things that are already happening, and it's easy for me to project on what will continue to happen or magnify as we move forward. But I think thinking that this is just the very beginning is very important for me as far as understanding that I need to buckle up and I need to think about what's going to happen, because it's not just about resisting whatever is happening right now. It's about a tendency that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to revert. And as much as for most translators that I've known, AI and technology has represented a threat, I really do think that this could be a very big opportunity. And I do think that there's a great deal of responsibility on the user to decide what this is ultimately going to become. And where are we already as far as translations and effectiveness or efficacy? So we ran a study on over 40 million words towards the end of 2023, and our study showed that on average, over 20 different languages, 12 different subject matters, including contents like marketing and copywriting, insurance, legal, so all kinds of very varied content and languages, were on average already at an 11.17% average edit distance. So and this is considering professional enterprise-grade translations. This is considering that the translators aren't being incentivized to change less. This is just considering what the machine is saying versus how humans would say it. We're already at 89% proximity, right? It's not about right or wrong. It's about 89% proximity between what humans would say and how a machine is trying to say the same thing. And the challenge is that the edit distance is going to go down to zero eventually. If not now, 2 years from now, if not 2 years from now, 5 years from now, if not 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This doesn't mean, however, that translations are going to be extinct. Very far from it. And this doesn't mean that translators will be reduced to a valueless position. Far from it. Again, I think it does mean that this will require a great degree of adaptation and flexibility from those involved. But it is something that's very far from something negative. And I'll explain why. So before I do, let's talk a little bit about context sensitivity, which is our approach in BureauWorks to AI. The idea is we're never leveraging a large language model as a translator. We're leveraging a large language model so that it can use its analytical capabilities to decide between the relevance of different kinds of content types. Why this is important is because different content types will have different degrees of linguistic relevance, and this linguistic relevance is very relative to the content itself, to the context, to the translator, to the style, etc. So when we look at the machine translation, that's one source of information, but we also look at glossaries, we also look at translation memories, and we're trying to provide an experience for the translator in which the engine is learning and adapting to and from them, right? So it's not about keeping a human in the loop, it's about the human sculpting this feed that's being produced. And there's a very complex framework behind it. Again, my goal for this presentation is not to dive into the complexity of this framework and overwhelm anybody. I just want to illustrate that it's not just about prompting a large language model. This is something much deeper. It's about how to integrate all kinds of knowledge sources together, how to learn from user experience, from user behavior, and how to work with something that's very close to your own digital twin. And the beauty is that this entire framework, it really frees translators up from the heavy lifting that's involved in translation. And I do hear a lot of pushback because there are a lot of people who got used to typing and got used to, crafting each and every word carefully. And I get it. But in my opinion, that's no longer going to be a valued skill for at least most kind of content types and situations. And again, translation has all kinds of niches and all kinds of specialties. And by no means am I saying that this is going to be the way that everybody's going to work. I mean, I can totally see how maybe a specific kind of marketing translator is going to still produce translations in Google Docs for the next 10, 20 years. I can see that as something that's possible. I don't think that's going to be the norm, though. I do think that the norm is going to be working much closer to an editorial kind of capacity. And this framework is partly why, right? So the translator is getting something that's been processed by all kinds of different data management systems that are trying to emulate how they communicate. So if their tone, for instance, is more formal, the suggestions are going to be more formal. If their tone is more informal, and this slide here is going to exemplify that. So if we click here on the play button, this is the sous chef. And what the sous chef does is that it allows the translators to get back this control over tonality, over register. And as they choose the different possibilities, the engine is learning from them, right? So it's a very powerful process that's taking place. And this process, in my opinion, it's all about catering to a higher level of mental faculty, right? And as this is all happening, we're already seeing divisions taking place as far as buyer camps, right? By buyer camps, I mean the actual translation buyers. So typically large translation buyers are global companies that operate in multiple locations, right? And because of all of this advent of GPT, we're already seeing an initial bifurcation where some companies are saying, I don't need translators. I can just do this all through generative AI. This is something real. This is something that's happening. In my opinion, right now, that's a very small minority of companies, but this camp will tend to grow over the coming years. Then we have another camp that says, I do need translators, but this camp then separates between the translators who they think who can work on their own versus companies that need Gen AI powered translators. This particular camp, the Gen AI powered translators, is the one that I feel personally that's growing the fastest. These are people that still want to rely on translators, but they believe that a much bigger productivity, yield, and quality can be unlocked through all of this technology, right? So it's very clear, again, don't want to propose that this is only going in a single direction. This is definitely going in multiple directions. And even this slide is just a gross oversimplification, just to show that people are making up their minds very differently about all of this. Now, when we talk about trends, the first trend is that language accessibility will become infinitely greater. Translations will become more pervasive. What do I mean by this? So right now, we don't think about language, most of us don't think about language as an accessibility issue, right? Let's say, for instance, someone is blind and they can't see something and that's written in Braille. Now, all of a sudden, they have access to that knowledge. So when we think about certain things that don't allow us to see certain things, for instance, that's very clearly an accessibility issue. But when we talk about language, let's say I speak, for instance, Brazilian Portuguese, and because something isn't accessible to me in Brazilian Portuguese, I can't see it. If that's the only language I speak, it's invisible to me. And in my opinion, the accessibility angle is going to become very much more important because companies are going to realize that not having something in a given language means that they can't sell to that given language. And as the cost for translations will become less expensive, and again, that's inevitable. The translation cost itself, and I'm saying that translators will make less. We have to keep that distinction in mind, right? The translation cost will get lower. not that translators will make less. And I'll explain how that paradox will resolve itself. But we're talking about more languages, more content will want to be localized. And this is super important because this is what's going to counterbalance the fact that they're going to cost less. So there's going to be this drive for accessibility. The same company that was previously localizing maybe just into Japanese, now they're also going to do Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, and they're also going to do ASL, and they're also going to do all kinds of different languages that they weren't thinking about. The other thing is that companies are going to localize things that they normally don't because they're prohibitive. Maybe it's their entire website as opposed to just a part of it. Maybe it's all of their support literature. Maybe it's all of their videos too. So we're talking about more languages and more content. Right now, a very small percentage of content that could get translated does get translated because it's very expensive to do so. So that's also something very important to talk about. So this summarizes my overall perspective. The unit cost will become lower, but translator income may become higher. May is the key word here because this is entirely contingent on how translators adapt to this new reality. So we're talking about more languages, more content, more audiences, also more versioning. This is something super important. The same content that was previously maybe just available English into Spanish, for instance, now it's going to be available into English into Spanish, Peru, for 18 to 35-year-old single mothers on an lower middle class bracket. Why? Because they can. It's going to become less expensive, so they can target content very specifically to specific kinds of user groups and demographics. And maybe they're going to market that for executives riding the bus. Maybe they're going to target this for travelers on a train. Maybe they're going to target this for little kids watching YouTube. And because you can unlock so much more potential as far as different versions and different possibilities. We're not just talking about now one piece of content going into one language. We're talking about one piece of content actually relating to all kinds of different kinds of identities and personas in different markets, right? So the unit cost will become lower. That's inevitable. The same, let's say, just if we go back in time, right? And we're talking about someone in a typewriter, maybe a translator in a typewriter could do 1,500 words a day. Through the computer, maybe now they could do 2,500 words a day. Now with a CAD tool, maybe they can do 3,000, 4,000 words a day. Now we're talking about translators who are basically going to be reading and changing maybe 10% of the content, maybe 5% of the content. The question is that the content that they will be changing will be very important. So they're going to be doing that little sprinkle of salt that's going to make the difference between the food tasting okay to wonderful, right? It's those little changes with high impact that are going to matter. So the unit cost will become lower, but translators who have the skills to make incredible impact in language, they may have actually a much higher income. The challenge is language will be the opportunities that language will be seen as a revenue enabler, as a driver of consumer decisions. The challenge, though, is that for those translators that were used to just being able to process words, that kind of work will become valueless because that kind of work, the more grunty work, that will be able to be captured by a large language model. The challenge is the actual humanness, the flavor, the empathy, the ability to resonate with a very particular user group and knowing exactly what needs to change to get that kind of result. The beauty is that revenue language as a revenue enabler has so much more value than just a translation, right? When we think about just a translation, that's just a commodity. It's like there's very little thought put into it. So it's like, oh, if you don't take this job, someone else can take this job, right? And very few occasions or exceptions where you have like, oh, it has to be this translator, this German translator I know, or this Japanese translator I know, or this Portuguese translator I know. In very few exceptions where you have clients have identified this need for ultra personalization. In most cases, when we take the industry at large, it's a very depersonalized and commoditized ability. When it becomes a revenue enabler, it gains strategic relevance for a company because now it's not just getting something translated into Italian, for instance. Now it's actually enabling sales in Italy. And the beauty is that through this entire framework, we will be able to tell a lot more the impact that a certain text is having in user behavior, in user experience. So this becomes something very powerful, right? We're not talking just translation anymore as a commodity. We're talking about it as a revenue enabler, which is a much higher value add. The challenge is, can you generate that enablement, right? Can you make those changes that are going to make that translation go from maybe a B to an A plus, or from an A minus to an A plus? Can you make those little edits that make all the difference, right? So the minutia of editorial decisions will become more valuable. The grunt work will become valueless. And I know that this can sound scary, but this is, in my opinion, it's already happening and it's going to continue to happen. The grunt work will be of very little value because the grunt work can be performed by large language models and these tech apparatuses that companies like ViroWorks are building. But the minutia of editorial decisions, that little spark of human brilliance, that will become incredibly valuable, and it will be easy to measure. All right, so things will already be translated, but they will need to be incessantly optimized for specific audiences, for specific outcomes. Right. So when we think about this language optimization characteristic, this is something super important, right? We're talking about tweaking, we're talking about redesigning, we're talking about iterating again and again, not publishing necessarily a final draft, but publishing something that allows you to look at the results and say, yeah, maybe this word should be that word, maybe this tone should be that tone, and being able to work a lot more closer to what, let's say, the role of a marketer would be than the role of a translator. And maybe you're thinking, oh, but this just applies to marketing content. But in my opinion, that's not true. Everything, to some degree, is creating a user impact. Maybe it's a service manual, and maybe users keep coming back to that service manual because it's so well written. Maybe it's terribly written and nobody even wants to look at it. They look at it once and they leave it. Right now, if that's in print, we can't measure it. But a digital service manual, that can be measured, the success of that. So we're talking about writing that's going to be also multimodal. The same content that was written in the service manual, that's also going to become maybe a video. That's also going to become a tutorial. That's also going to become a walkthrough. So the value of content will become even more important because it will exist in so many different modalities, right? And language optimization engineering will become a very valuable thing. Again, the optimization engineering is not about finding the right word from a technical perspective anymore. It's about finding the right word that achieves the right resonance with a very specific user target group. That skill is going to be incredibly valuable and is already valuable, but it's going to become incredibly more valuable. So, and in terms of this value, there's two paths, right? We're talking about a bifurcation. You're either going down a subject matter expert route where you, let's say, are the person who most understands B2B, SaaS, tech sales in Brazil, and you're going to be that person, or you're the patents lawyer in Germany, or you're the chemical engineer in Japan. You're that subject matter for that expert for that specific area or niche, or you're what I call a language wizard. And the language wizard is that person who understands, oh, in this particular scenario, it's much better to use the idea perspective than outlook. Or in this scenario, it's much better to use this pronoun than that pronoun, or this verb tense than this verb tense, and how people relate to that. So in my opinion, for those two camps, we're talking about a lot of opportunity. And it won't be about the number of edits that we make, but it will be about the impact and how this will be measured. So right now, right, we're working at a per word model and maybe a per hour model, but in my opinion, those models are all very limited as far as measuring value, right? They just measure cost. Think about it. Cost is one thing, value is another thing. So they're measuring cost, your cost. But when we talk about measuring value, which people are already measuring, by the way, maybe it's a website you produced, you translated, maybe it's a social tweet, something, but there are analytics around anything that's digital. Unless it's only in print, there are analytics around it. And people know the impact that that's creating. Now imagine, for instance, that you translate something incredibly well, and that generates a great impact for a certain company. Wouldn't it make more sense to be paid based on that impact, or at least proportionally to that impact, than just based on your cost, right? That opportunity unlocks a whole new potential business income. And I completely understand the economic complexities behind what I'm proposing, right? I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to happen, but I'm saying that there is potential for this to happen as companies realize that there is so much more economic impact from translations than just getting things into a different language, right? Translation quality will transcend technical aspect and become a matter of performance, right? So we're not talking about anymore about whether the subject is agreeing with the verb tense, or whether the spelling is correct or incorrect, or whether it's saying correctly translated, incorrectly translated. In my opinion, what's really going to matter is how does it perform? What's the click-through rate? What's the average time on the content? What are the number of likes, the reshares, etc.? And this may seem like this is just for social stuff, but it's not. The entire internet is measured in some way or form, right? Whether it's an email that's being sent, whether it's a social post, whether it's a blog, whether it's a website, whether it's a video, everything is being measured. Any kind of media that's digital is being measured. And it's the ability to perform that's going to matter, right? Maybe I delivered something impeccable, but performs terribly. Maybe my peer delivered something that's full of mistakes, but it performs really well. Their translation will be better than mine. So translators will become more than mere vessels of communication to actual owners of outcomes. That's super important, right? That's a much more valuable trade when you own an outcome rather than you just communicate something. So think about it, right? Who's more valuable? Is it the translator who just conveys a message to the king, or the translator who conveys the message so that the king signs the treaty, right? That's the future. Do you get the king to sign the treaty based on your message? So early adopters, they have an edge. That's the key thing I want to leave everybody with today. People who adopt this tech early, they have a huge edge because this trajectory is just getting started, right? And you do have the option of resisting. That's entirely up to you. Again, I'm not here to try to sell anything to anybody, but I do want to offer this perspective, the perspective that if you embrace something sooner rather than later, you're much more likely to be benefited from a positive outcome down the road. So just think about that, because we're such at this beginning of this trajectory, right? If you insist in, for instance, producing grunt work as opposed to migrating into this approach where you're more of an editor, by the time this entire wave catches up with you, it's going to be so much harder for you to move into a different perspective. And skills that have been buried and latent will resurface stronger than ever, right? Empathy, emotional resonance, critical literary theory, discourse analysis, marketing, connection to current linguistic trends, appreciation for different communication styles. Like the ability to communicate, to truly communicate, that's going to stand out so much more. And I hear from a lot of translators, but I already do this in my current work. Maybe you do that, but it doesn't stand out because that's not how people are paying most translators for their work. Again, they're paying it based on the cost. They're paying based on a commoditization of that kind of labor, as opposed to paying for the business potential that is unlocked through that. So these skills, they have a lot more value, right? And they will become, in my opinion, ever more important. And I want to open it to questions. If not through this amazing summit that Josh and Nora have put together, offline, through LinkedIn, through my inbox, I really want to keep this dialogue going. I highly encourage each and every one of you to try out BureauWorks, to sign up for our free workshops, and to see what can be produced using a different kind of mindset and using a different kind of technological framework. So I'm very appreciative for everybody's time. Really, thank you so much for listening, for all of your attention. Sorry if I crammed so much information into a short amount of time, but I'm here and I wanted to make sure I made an impact. And take care, be well, and let's explore together. Bye-bye.